Mark chapter 4, beginning of verse 35. On that day, when evening came, he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith?" Or, as Matthew says, little faith. They became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Jesus before this had been teaching in and around the area of Capernaum, which is on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And leaving the crowd there, he takes a boat and he's taking them to the other side, the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, as we see here. And of course, there was a storm that came up. But it says in verse 38, Jesus was asleep in this cushion, or in the stern of the boat. You know, that's the only time recorded in Scripture where we see that Jesus was sleeping. Right here. And I think that's for a reason. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. And so we see that they were afraid, and Jesus got up and he said, "Peace, be still," and the area became perfectly calm. And then he went into the lesson he wanted to teach them, that they needed to have faith. You know, there's lessons here in this story, a lot of lessons, and one faith lesson is silent and one faith lesson is spoken. I think the faith lesson that is silent is that Jesus was asleep in the boat. He had faith in his Father, didn't he? Laying in the boat. He showed his faith by him sleeping there. I think the spoken lesson is peace, be still, that they needed to trust him to get them to the other side. But there's also a fear lesson in the story, a couple of fear lessons, both a positive and a negative. The fear lesson in this story, the negative one, is the wrong fear, as they were afraid of the storm when Jesus was in the boat. But the fear lesson that was the right one was their fear in Christ. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? So there's a silent and a spoken faith lesson, and there's a positive and a negative fear lesson in this story, as lessons in this story as well. Of course, analogies have been made to this story about the boat and about the storm. For example, the boat is the Christian, the storm is the troubles and temptations of life, and that can certainly be so. One of the figures here, that the boat is the church and the waves and the things around it is the world, and so forth. Or the boat is the heart, the mind, and the soul, and the wind and the waves around them are Satan's influence, or trying to thwart that heart and soul that have dedicated themselves to Christ. So there's a lot of lessons in this story. As we also look at this story and look at scriptures in general, and we've talked about this before in the past, but the natural elements in Scripture have always been the area of God to display his power. Always been the area for him to use, if you'll notice. You can go back to the great flood in Genesis chapter 6. God brought about the great flood. You can talk about the raining of fire and brimstone on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. You can talk about the plagues of Egypt, right? The 10 plagues of Egypt that God used upon them. You can talk about the parting and the closing of the Red Sea, right? You can talk about the quaking of Mount Sinai, the giving of the law, and the smoke and the fire that was on top of the mountain. You can talk about the cutting off of the waters of the Jordan to allow Joshua and the children of Israel to cross with dry land. And you talk about the slaying of the armies of the 5 kings of the Amorites by hailstones that were sent by God as they were fleeing Joshua. And so you can see why the men were astounded and afraid, because they looked back at that Old Testament And they saw all those great things that happened in the elements that God had happened. And then here is this man that stands up in the boat. He says 3 words and the same thing happens. Only God can do that, is in their minds. Who is this man that only that the wind and the sea obey his voice? The wind and the sea obey God's voice at the Red Sea in the great flood, didn't they not? In the Jordan River. And so, yes, they would be afraid. They would be perplexed at this. But we see that a great storm came up, and from what I understand, and you know as well, that the Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake. And of course, it's below sea level there. And so there's a lot of hills around there. The lake itself is approximately 13 miles long, 8 miles wide, for those who are taking the test next week. But anyway, it's surrounded by sloping hills and mountains all around it. And so because of the terrain that's around it, from what I'm told, it's not uncommon for a sudden storm to come up on that lake. It's below sea level, there are mountains and so forth, the winds and so forth that come in and can blow up a sudden storm, and it can whip up over the sea. Now we see here in verse 37, there was a fierce wind that caused the water to rise and start to fill the boat. And as we think about the men that's going across that lake, we see Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, experienced fishermen. And they know that this storm is a killer storm. They've seen storms before on the Sea of Galilee. They've seen probably many storms on the Sea of Galilee as they were fishing. And they saw that this storm was exceptionally bad, and so bad that they were afraid for their own life. They say in verse 38, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" We're going to die out here in the middle of this sea because of the storm. The wind's coming, the contrary, it's coming over the edges of the boat. We can't bail fast enough to get the water out, if you will. And here we are, we're going to the bottom of the sea. The wind was exceedingly violent there. Basically, it was a killer storm. It was a killer storm that they were in the midst of there. And they knew it as experienced fishermen. You see, the attitude of the man and their reaction is really the attitude that a lot of us would have. We would be afraid of losing our life. And it's a natural reaction. It really is. The real sorrow of this story, however, is not the fact that they would lose their life. The real sorrow of this story is they forgot who was in the boat with them. That's the real sorrow of this story. I don't know how I would have reacted if I was in that boat. I probably would have reacted the same way. I'm not going to say that I wouldn't, but I hope that I wouldn't. But I probably would. And I'd need the same lesson that Peter, James, and John did, and the others as well. And so when the troubles of life hit, even facing the point of our own mortality, do we forget that the master of ocean, earth, and sky is in the boat? He's in our boat. He goes along with us. He takes care of us. As Jesus tells Martha in John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, he says, "I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? He asked Martha the question, do you believe it? Do you believe that I'm the resurrection and the life? Do you believe that if you believe in me, that you will not die the permanent death, that you will live eternally? Do you believe this? And I believe that's also one of the lessons he's teaching these men in this boat. Because Jesus had already told them he's going to be going someplace else. He's going to be going away. He's not going to be dying at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee. They know that. They've already been told that. And he has selected them to be his disciples. And he's already given them assurances of what they were going to do. And so they knew that really, thinking about it, the end of their life wasn't going to be in the bottom of this sea. This storm shouldn't ground us, because Jesus said these things are going to happen. But of course, we forget that, don't we? In the midst of the trouble. And in our life, we forget that in the midst of the trouble. Lord, you say, I'm going down. Didn't I tell you I'd be with you? Lord, there's a lot of trouble that's going on around in my life, and I'm being pulled in 16 different directions. I'm with you. Don't forget that at all. And so we see this reaction. It's a natural reaction, yet it's something that they should have known better about doing, really. Because they should have known who was in the boat with them. And Jesus here, of course, tells us they had a lack of faith. Was the problem? They had a lack of faith. God requires his children to have faith. Faith is the catalyst and conviction of our salvation. Christ had already told them they're going to the other side in verse 35, as we talked about a little while ago in months past. Let us go over to the other side. What does that mean when Christ says it? You're going to the other side, right? If you and I had gotten in the boat and said, we're going to the other side, wouldn't have been a guarantee, because the storm could have came up and we would have went to the bottom of the sea. But with Christ, hey, we're going to the other side. Should they have listened? Yeah. But again, the storm came up. They got afraid. A natural thing. But still, they should have known who was in the boat. We're going to the other side. We're not going to die in the middle of the sea. I just told you before we left. We're going to the other side. And this faith that they had, this lack of faith, cultivated fear. It cultivated the wrong type of fear. It was fear in the storm instead of fear in the one who can control the storm. And so the Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews 11 and verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please God. We're studying Hebrews chapter 11 on Wednesday night. We'll be there about 67 weeks. No, not really. But we're taking our time there. 2 or 3 weeks, I guess. But there we see the great men and women of faith, and they had confidence in God in things that they didn't even see. Promises that God made that through them would be fulfilled that we're a part of today down the road. And so we're to have that same type of faith. Jesus said if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains, Matthew 17 and verse 20. Of course, we forget we're not the one moving the mountains, it's God that's moving the mountains. We have to have faith in God to move the mountains, you see, in our lives. And so faith was necessary, but they lacked, if you will, that faith that they were supposed to have in the man who was sleeping there in the stern. I can't believe he's sleeping there. And people say, well, he must have been very tired. I don't think that's the issue here, guys. And the reason I don't think that's the issue is that you would have to be literally unconscious not to get up in a boat like that. If you're dead dog tired, I mean wore to a frazzle, and you're in a boat and it's about to go down, you aren't asleep, guys. You are not asleep. Your adrenaline is going, is it not? You are bailing water. You found a new source of energy, didn't you? The fight or flight, right? The preservative of life. And so I don't care how tired you were, you'd have to be literally unconscious to stay asleep. I believe the Lord was asleep in that boat because he knew he was going to the other side, and he had full assurance in his Father that everything's going to be all right. A storm? What? A storm? Huh? What? Why'd you wake me up? I'm trying to sleep over here. How could you sleep in this storm? I have faith in my Father. I'm going to the other side. I've got a destiny. You should know that. Well, they didn't. We probably wouldn't either, to be honest with you. We'd probably be the same way. Maybe, I don't know. Need to learn that lesson, don't we? But he was asleep. The storm was raging, and Jesus was asleep. And Jesus knew that he came to complete the task of his Father, and he knew his destiny would not be death in that sea, but it would be death on the cross. Death on the cross. He knew in John chapter 3 and verse 14, he told Nicodemus, if I need to be lifted up, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness before this happened. And so in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39, he says, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet as not as I will, but as you will. Father, your will be done. Right? So he always had faith and confidence in his Father, in what he needed to do for his Father, as we talked about this morning. And so they start on one side of the sea. We're going to go to the other side. He's been teaching over here. He's going to the other side over here. And by the way, when he gets to the other side, he's going to meet a man among the tombs, the Gerasene demoniac. And that's all going to happen right over there. He's going to the other side. They get out in the middle of this lake, if you will, and a big storm comes up. It's a killer storm. Experienced fishermen know it's a killer storm. Jesus is asleep in the boat. They get up and they wake him. Do you not care that we're perishing? He gets up and he says, peace be still. You know why he said peace be still? It wasn't for him, it was for them. You know why he says that in our life? It's not for him, it's for us. Prince of Peace, right? Who can bring peace in our life. With 3 small words, he made everything instantly calm. And this should be no surprise, since the power of the Word of God created all things, he being the Word. Should be no surprise. And so here he is, speaking 3 small words. I want to ask you a question. Do the words of Jesus bring you peace and comfort in your life? You know, I don't know if this is the right thing to do or not. And we've talked about this before. But when I read it, when Jesus is saying, I perk up a little more. I don't know what kind of reaction that is. I should read all the Bible and perk up, right? It's not like I fall asleep when I read. But when you're reading along and Jesus is speaking, oh, I need to pay extra attention. I don't know if that's right or not. Has that happened to you? Or am I the only weird one? It's something about it, isn't it? Just, you know, I need to listen. I need to listen to this man. And so these men needed to listen to this man and understand what he said. I understand where they were in their faith. It was growing. They were getting to a certain point. But nonetheless, they needed to find comfort in the words of Jesus even before that, and maybe they wouldn't have got as panicked as they did while they were in the boats. But he did let them know that his word could give them peace by saying, peace be still. And Jesus can say that in our lives. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, Jesus makes this point. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. If you hear the words of Jesus and you act on those words, you're a wise man and you've built your house on a firm foundation. And it's not going to crash when the winds and storms come up. These men had not yet built their house on his word, because when they were in the storm, they were afraid. They were afraid of the storm, and then they got the real fear they needed, afraid of him. Who is this? I was afraid. Who is this that the winds and the sea obey him? Only God can do that, right? But Jesus said in Matthew 7, we need to listen to him. We need to see what he has to say for us and find that comfort, that foundation, if you will, in our lives. Again, I don't know how I would react in this situation. I'd probably be afraid too. I'm not going to be too hard on those men. Not too hard, but again, a little hard in the fact that they should have known who was in the boat and the things that he had already done for them. And knowing that he is, and they believed at that point that he was at least the Messiah, if you will, the Son of God. And so when those winds and storms come up in our lives, we know that Jesus can be there no matter what may happen and say, peace be still. I wonder how much faith they would have had in Jesus if they had went down into that sea for a while. Because remember, their destiny was to the other side. The boat hadn't capsized. Nobody's gone overboard here, but it's going to kill them. And then, just like Peter did in another time, when he's walking across the water and he begins to sink, I'm perishing. Remember? I'm perishing. At that point, when Peter was sinking, didn't he know that the Lord had plans for him? And didn't he know that the Lord was not going to let him drown in that situation? Because what he already said to him. But he reached out and picked him up anyway. That's you and me, guys. We sink. Oh, Lord, don't you care? Oh, no, Lord, we're perishing. Don't you know that I'm there? Don't you know that I care? Let me lift you up and dust you off. Well, in that case, dry you off a little bit. Come on, let's get in the boat and let's get to the other side. Have a little faith. Have a little faith. So what spiritual lessons can we take from this story tonight? What spiritual lessons? There's many, of course. We've talked about a few, but I want to kind of put them in a little box, if you will, to wrap things up. I think one spiritual lesson that we can learn from this story, there's no storm in life that Jesus cannot still. Probably the two toughest storms that we go through in life is the death of a loved one and a terminal illness. There may be others that are almost to that point that give us a lot of trouble. Death of a loved one and a terminal illness. Those are probably the biggest tests we have concerning those type of things, depending on who had died, depending on what the situation is with our illness. But even in those storms that we have, we can find peace in Jesus by the fact that we're a child of God, and that if that loved one is one who I have confidence in and so forth, that as far as being a child of God and being one who has followed, we can have confidence in God will see me through that sadness in my life to have come to certain realizations about that, about myself and the peace that brings me. And even if it has a terminal illness, of course, that's probably even tougher in a sense. That if I'm a child of God, even through all of that, I've got this peace that's no matter what happens, it's going to be okay. Because I have eternity waiting for me. I have something better waiting for me. I think a second spiritual lesson that we can get from this story is true faith is the key to all storms in life. True faith is the key to all storms in life. These men did not quite have the faith they needed to yet. They had faith, they had little faith. But they had forgotten in the trouble that they were having who they have faith in who could get them through it. And sometimes that happens with us. The storms of life kind of eat away at our faith, like the sea eats at the sand, like the sea eats at the seashore. But as you know, the Lord, through the storms of life, if we have the faith, that true faith, the key, it can get us through. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right. He's going to get us through. I think a third spiritual lesson that we can take from this story is that let's not let our fear take our focus off Jesus. Peter did that. They did this here. They let the fear of the storm take them off their focus of who was in the boat with them. And oftentimes that does happen with us. Do we sometimes take our focus off Jesus? I do. Do you? It happens. If that doesn't happen to you, give me your formula. Okay? I'd like to know. Sometimes I take my focus off Jesus when these fears come up. Especially when I look around me in the world. The wars and the political turmoil and all these other things. And sometimes a little anxiety comes over me about those things. What about you? A little angst. But in those moments, I've taken 1 eye or maybe 2 off Jesus, haven't I? I sure have. Do I believe that God is in control? Well, I do, but do I forget it sometimes? Yeah, I do. And I let fear and anxiety take me over. Nothing wrong with being concerned. Nothing wrong with being informed. What's wrong with me is I let let that go over into an anxiety and fear, and it takes my focus off Jesus. I let it go too far, don't I? So I've got to be careful of that. Don't let fear take your focus off Jesus, off who's in the boat with you. And number 4. And this wraps it up here. Remember that Jesus is in the boat with you. Very simple. Remember, he's in the boat with you. Whatever that boat is, if it's yourself, if it's your life, if it's your family, if it's your church family, or whatever that boat equates to in your life, and it equates to many things, Jesus is still in that boat. And guess what? He's asleep. What does that mean? He's the calming element, isn't it? That's what that means. He's the calming element. You know, when those men got all afraid and all stirred up, and this goes to this 4th point, and they turned around and they saw Jesus asleep in the boat, you know what they should have thought? Well, if he's asleep, everything's going to be okay. Right? If he's asleep, everything's going to be okay. I mean, he's not worried about it. He wasn't unconscious, brethren, and he wasn't too tired not to get up. He was sleeping because of his faith in his Father. And so that's what they should have recognized. They should have remembered that Jesus was in the boat with them, looking around. Okay, Jesus is asleep. Let's do a little bailing and get to the other side, because that's what he said is going to happen. And that's what needs to be our attitude. When the storms of life come up, look around, Jesus asleep in the boat, seeing faith in that. Well, let me do a little bailing and get to the other side, because I know, because he's with me. He's bringing that calming element in my life. That's what they should have recognized when they turned around and saw him asleep. So, as we wrap this up tonight, and we look at this story, this beautiful story of faith, there are many lessons for us we've gone over tonight. But we need to look at ourselves individually. I look at myself and you look at yourself, and where our faith lies, and what our faith can get us through in this life. And not to be sidetracked by the things in the life in our faith, and taking the focus off Jesus. And understanding who's in the boat of our life with us. You know, there's a lot of things that can distract us in those things. A lot of things that Satan uses to distract us in those things. Oh, he's not really with you. Oh, he doesn't care. Oh, look what you're going through. If he cared, you wouldn't be going through it. Right? If you really cared, and a lot of people lose their faith in those types of situations. But remember the ultimate goal. The Lord will see us through, whether in this life or the next. We're going home. This is a temporary place. And we have troubles here. No bed of roses. No bed of roses. But still, we understand with him, we're going home. Better place, right? So let's just get through it together, right? And go on in eternity and put this behind us. What about that? What about that? So if there's anyone here tonight who needs anything at all, we always offer the invitation to you. The invitation, I want to make clear that the invitation is always open. There is no time limit on the invitation. Okay, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is the invitation. We do it at this time merely as a convenience. That's what it is. We're here. So while we're here, if there's anything that you need, in an hour, if you get home and you decide you need, let us know. We'll get back here. We'll help you best we can, or get where you are, if you will. In 2 days, if you need help, let us know. We'll get back to you. I mean, what I mean by that, we'll get back to you later. we'll try to do our best to get where you are. Or anything. That was terrible. But you know what I mean. I'm done. So if you need anything at all, please come. Sing this song.